Good evening. I'm Steve Weberg of the Kansas City Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us tonight. Apologize for the slight delay. We're making sure that we had all of our technical I's dotted and T's crossed. So I think we are ready to go. We're coming to you virtually again, as we've done with our signature programming and many more of our library services for more than a year, but we're moving closer to a return to gathering for these events in person. The library reaches an important milestone next week on Tuesday, June 1st, when we reopen our locations and resume many of our normal operations. You'll be able to come in, pick up books you've reserved, use computers on the spot, take in exhibits in our two art galleries, or just wander and browse the shelves, which really is the essence of the library experience. So we're close to being whole again, and of course, being open to, to all. It starts with being open, period. And we'll be even closer when we can bring George Koo, whom we have tonight, and other renowned speakers and presenters here to Kansas City and into our library auditoriums and welcome them and all of you in person. That's perhaps a few months away, but as we continue to monitor health and safety guidelines and gauge our readiness and your readiness to be part of larger gatherings. In the meantime, we're thankful we can continue to gather online, and we're particularly thankful to have with us tonight one of the nation's most renowned authorities on educational policy, George Koo. Higher education, our nation's colleges and universities faced a number of challenges before the pandemic, and they've only been compounded. A year and a half ago, Dr. Koo, who has spent more than 50 years in higher education, identified three of the greatest issues, or what he saw as three of the greatest issues: cost, which has outstripped inflation for decades; completion, high dropout rates and graduation rates that are likely to hit 50 or 60% at some schools; and credibility. If a student runs up heavy student debt loan and doesn't finish, or doesn't get the kind of job he or she wanted or expected, or if they're not leaving college with the kinds of skills they need. That's where high impact practices come in: study abroad, participation in learning communities, internships. Studies show that they make a student's time in college more meaningful, and that they provide substantial education benefits, especially for students who start further behind in terms of entering academic test scores, and also for those from communities that historically have been underserved in higher education. They help students reap the full benefits, economic, civic, personal, of attending college. No one speaks to this issue with more authority than George Koo. He is the Chancellor's Professor Emeritus of Higher Education at Indiana University. He's the founding director of IU's Center of Post-Secondary Research and founding director and senior scholar with the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, which is based in Champaign, Illinois. Dr. Koo is the author of more than 400 published works on topics related to institutional improvement, college student engagement, assessment strategies, campus cultures. Chronicle of Higher Education once described him as a, quote, towering figure who really launched the field of assessment of institutional quality. We are so privileged to have him here with us tonight. Dr. Koo, thank you so much for joining us.
Steve, thank you for that really over-the-top introduction. And your synopsis of what I'm about to say is so good that maybe we should just stop here and go into the Q&A. I mean, I really appreciate that. My recollection is first in Kansas City 50 years ago in 1971. And I just want to tell you just a very brief story. I was there to look at UMKC as a possible place to do doctoral study. And I was there because of a fellow by the name of Dr. Joe Doerr, D-O-E-R-R. And I hope there may be somebody tuning in who knows this name and may even know of him. he has a zero digital footprint. I was there because I ran into Joe as a master's student. He was teaching a summer class up at St. Cloud State, where I happened to be. And I recognized him. And when he called the class roll, he actually pronounced my last name correctly. And it turned out that he was a guidance counselor at my high school. I went to a large high school on the south side, southern suburb of Chicago, 800 kids in my graduating class. And he was kind of a gym rat. And I was, if there was a ball around, I was involved, basketball, football, whatever it was. But in any event, apparently I did well enough in Dr. Doerr's class where he said, you should think about a doctorate, which of course had never crossed my mind at the time. And so it went. I visited, he put me up in his home, his family, met students, and I had a wonderful experience. I ended up at the University of Iowa for doctoral study. Don't think less of me, good friends from Kansas City. But that was a very pivotal moment when he said, you ought to think about going on for a doctorate. So I want to talk a little bit more, dive a little deeper into some of the things that Steve has already said about how to make college matter more. Higher ed, colleges and universities have taken a fairly good beating in the last couple of decades about credibility. These are just covers of magazines, dating back some time. There's a lot of challenges that we face, no more so than trying to assure the public and assure individual students that going to college really does matter in terms of preparing them for a life of success. Now, I want to be clear about this cartoon, and there are some cartoons, I hope you find them at least mildly amusing, but this one is not a slam about the cultural and performing arts. In fact, I was involved in a project that tracked for some years the lives and careers of people with arts intensive training. Very interesting group of people from which we can learn a lot in terms of individual performance and how to make it in a world where individual effort really matters. Some of you will recognize perhaps this. It was a commercial, right, for Wendy's back in the mid-'80s. The woman on the right is 81-year-old at the time, Clara Peller, who actually made a career out of this, where's the beef? And for me, thinking about higher ed today, where is the beef? Where is the learning? Where is the evidence that students are coming out of their credential or four-year baccalaureate experience ready to do what the world wants from them? And what the world wants, what employers want, is more. They want students that are able to take on, as the slide says, more responsibilities. They need to figure out how to work more effectively with people from other backgrounds, the challenges that they have to deal with, more complex and so forth and so on. Bottom line, as this bottom line says, we want people who have higher levels of learning and knowledge than ever before. So here's the drill. A word or two more about the current context that Steve has already kind of shared with us, then a little more about what the world wants. And I'm going to talk then about student engagement, which is absolutely essential to everything that matters, and then wind our way into these high impact practices that Steve has mentioned, and a few implications, not just for colleges and universities, but for others who work with students even before they get to college. So, okay, we've come out the last 16, 18 months. Everything is about COVID. I'm not going to go into these things, but you can read them for yourselves. Most students, most of the time, went remote, learning from home or some other place than the campus. Faculty had to learn a lot quickly about online delivery, which increased stress, not just for faculty, but also for students. There was less of this very important interaction between students and their teachers and so forth. And then these equity gaps that we're reading more about, whether they're economic, ethnicity related, these gaps, that is the less well prepared, having less access and doing less well, these were exacerbated during COVID. And then the bottom line, institutions had to spend more to get this work done. And of course, they took in less income as fewer students enrolled and so forth and so on. But there have been other circumstances that have been building over the last 3 and 4 decades. We have more and more students from increasingly diverse backgrounds, which actually turns out to be beneficial. We may get into that later, maybe not, but many of these students are underprepared. And this is not just a function of the last 2 or 3 or 5 years. American College Testing Program has been telling us this for 25 and 30 years, that only about half of the students finishing high school can read, for example, at college level. And then the costs have gone up. And we read a lot about this in the popular media, but it's not just about institutions charging more. This word compliance, there are a number of federal and state groups and requirements that make it, that mandate institutions do more of this work behind the scenes, filing reports and so forth and so on. Students are paying more as states have invested less. We see a slight, very modest rebound from the last recession back in 2007, 2008. Institutions have responded by increasing the number of part-time instructors, which means that they're paid less. We can quibble and talk about the quality of instruction they deliver. Some do every bit as well as full-time faculty members, others perhaps not so much. And then this bottom line, we were once the envy of the so-called modern world. Well, we're still ranked up there. Most places still look at us for leadership and the levels of prestige and so forth that our universities have across the globe. But we, as Steve has already mentioned, we aren't graduating as many students as we should. And these disparities inside, right? Fewer students from low income backgrounds, fewer students who have been less well prepared, fewer students graduate from different racial and ethnic groups. This is a problem, these equity gaps. And then there's this overarching issue about educational quality. Are institutions delivering what they have promised? And what the world wants is this long sentence here, right? I was an English major, shouldn't have so many words in an individual sentence, but look, this is what students need to survive and thrive during and after college. Do they know what they need to know? Are they proficient in the kinds of activities that the world, employers, their church, their neighborhoods require? And these dispositions, I want to talk about dispositions later, because we don't offer majors in dispositions like interpersonal competence. But if you're looking for triggers in terms of what will allow an individual to be self-sufficient and intellectually alert and civically informed and engaged, some of these dispositions, interpersonal competence are absolutely critical, even though we don't teach them directly in colleges and universities. So have a look at this slide. This is Tony Carnevale and his colleagues at Georgetown at this center. They've got a very interesting set of tasks that they perform. They look at the world of work and the people who are doing different kinds of jobs in different kinds of settings. They look at where these people have come from, how they progressed post-college in terms of getting promotions and making more money and so forth. They look at that hundreds of different variables. And one of the conclusions they drew that really stunned me in a way, intuitively I bought this, but with the data, one of the conclusions they draw is that it really doesn't make much difference where you go to school. That's this institutional selectivity point. Where you went really is not a predictor of how well you do later across the board. And it doesn't make any difference really what you majored in. What matters to the kinds of outcomes they're looking at, and I think they're the kinds of outcomes that we would all say are signs of success, is this set of broad cross-cutting capacities, they say. And for me, I boiled them down, if you will, at this stage of my life. It's whether students will be able to learn how to think about their own thinking, which I claim is an unnatural human act, right? In real time, to be thinking about what I'm experiencing. And when you're in college, inside, outside the classroom, and then of course, post-college, very important. Then how can I use what it is I'm learning? And where do I get opportunities to practice that learning while I'm involved in the learning, to deal with different things that haven't been presented to me in a lecture or a textbook or whatever I'm reading off the web. And then this integration of these ideas, my skills, proficiencies, and so forth and so on. What am I making of that? And this is kind of a recursive activity. These are not linear steps. We continue to do these things throughout the lifespan. But accomplishing these major tasks, at least at a moderate level during the university college experience, very, very important. So how do we, I hope you're chuckling at home at this. Where does this miracle occur? How can we assure that students are getting these kinds of experiences and leaving with the kinds of outcomes we want? Well, we've known for decades, really, that this, well, we call it now student engagement, but this is Ernie Pasquarella and Pat Teranzini, two eminent scholars reviewing, 3,500, 4,000 major studies. They've done this work now twice, and it's since been updated. But what they're saying is, look, yeah, who people are kind of matters when they start school and what they do. But what institutions ought to be doing is somehow funneling and channeling students into activities and experiences that are going to help create the kinds of outcomes we want. And we call it student engagement these days. The time and very important effort, not just time, but it's the effort that students put forth in what we call this jargony term, educationally purposeful activities. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. We know a lot about that, and not all of what matters is going to take place, if you will, in a classroom or a lab or a studio, right? So this is UMKC, and that's Kansas City, the city in the backdrop, and so forth and so on. And of course, it's not just the whole city, it's today a whole world, really, where the learning can take place. And so what happens, not just in class, but out of class, is very, very important. And institutions that do their work well recognize this to try to create more coherence between what's going on in class and helping students find opportunities to apply what they're learning outside of class, on and off the campus. So there's this, as I call it, rich harvest of learning that's outside the classroom. You just do the math. If students are spending 7 of 10 of their waking hours doing something other than being in class, and who are they with? Family members, coworkers, being in the company, choosing the right friends becomes very, very important in terms of what one gets out of college, because they tend to influence what one does during college. So, as I've said, we can use the classroom, the out-of-class experience, as kind of a laboratory where students get practice in using what they're learning. And then these, as I've said earlier, these dispositional attributes that we don't offer majors in: resilience, conscientiousness, working effectively with people from different backgrounds. And we know now a lot more about how to design and move students into the kinds of experiences that will help students develop these kinds of attributes and better prepare them for life after college. So it's a simple matter. The trifecta here. What students do, very, very important, but also important is what institutions do, using more often across the campus these effective educational practices. And we've been able, I and colleagues have studied now multiple times what makes an, quote, educationally effective institution. They have figured out through policies and practices how to move students into what we call the right activities, things that we have known really for decades in terms of what matters to high student performance, setting the expectations high. Time on task, I've already mentioned, making certain that we give students assignments that require them to be active in terms of seeking solutions to problems, giving students feedback in this prompt, reliable manner. Nothing more important, really. None of us performs at the highest level without feedback, and of course, the interactions that the students have with their teachers and other staff, and learning how to work together with their colleagues. Is there anything more important post-college than knowing how to work effectively with your coworkers? I think not. And then understanding that students, particularly now with increasing diversity, there are different learning, different approaches to learning that can matter most. So student engagement is a key. I said it was essential because it's associated with the things that we know matter: getting better grades, staying in school, finishing, student satisfaction. We're not running universities as a summer camp, but if students aren't satisfied, at least at a moderate level, they tend to walk and find a place to go elsewhere. But most important, the amount of time and effort students spend on things that matter are related to the kinds of outcomes, these gains, that we know are very, very important. Now, the world's a complicated place, so it's not uniform. Some of these effects we say in the business conditional, that is, some students might benefit more from certain kinds of activities than others. Simple examples, we know that women, undergraduate female students, tend to be, quote, more engaged across the board, doing more of the right things than their male counterparts. But that's on average, because in both groups, there are some men, of course, who outperform women on a given campus, but they tend to be in the minority, at least in terms of what the data show. Their conditional effect is students who live on campus are more engaged. Of course, they have more easier access, if you will, to campus resources and so forth than those who commute, who live at home or some distance from the campus for whatever the reasons might be. But then we've discovered now almost 15 years ago that when students do certain things, these kinds of activities have these unbelievably positive effects, and we've come to call them now high impact practices. And we released this. This is a 2008 study that, excuse me, folks, that set forth this this pattern of information. In fact, when we first started looking at the data back in 2006, the results were so astounding. I said there must be something wrong with the analysis. And it turns out we kept running the data, came up with the same thing, that we found out that if students did one or more of these kinds of activities, I'm going to spare you from going through each of these. Some of these have pretty obvious face validity to them. Writing intensive courses, of course, as Steve's already mentioned, things like study abroad, that would be the global learning bullet, community-based service learning, internships, and so on. These things are pretty obvious to us, and almost every campus offers some version of these kinds of activities, right? Capstone, next to the second to the bottom, a capstone experience where students demonstrate through some form. We used to think about, comprehensive exams. Well, there are fewer of those today and more project-based activities to show faculty and others, and to employers, that I've actually learned what I was supposed to here, and moreover, I can apply it and use it in different kinds of circumstances, right? So here's the thing, these high impact practices, students who do at least one of these, they're more likely to graduate. And they're more likely to demonstrate these gains across the board: reading, writing, critical thinking, right? Analytical ability, and so on. They have, as Steve hinted at this in his introduction, salutary effects from students who come from lower economic circumstances, who are less well prepared for college, who are, very important, first in their family to attend college. These everybody benefits from high impact practices, but students from these underserved backgrounds actually get a boost in their performance by participating. And less well known is that if you are involved in one of these, the psychological size of the institution tends to shrink. In my language, tends to shrink. In other words, I get to know, a group of students much better than I would have otherwise. These are not my high school pals, right, or people necessarily that I work with. These are people I don't know, but because we're working together on projects and tasks, whether it's in a research lab or whether it's a site off campus and service learning and so forth, these kinds of activities help a student know a teacher better, and also foster this very important, increasingly important sense of belonging. You know, this is the place where I should be. And then these are the kinds of activities that employers love because students are getting this applied, hands-on, real life kinds of experiences. And the more of these activities one participates in, this is the bottom line here, there are these cumulative additive effects, meaning students benefit even more the more of these that they do. And then I mentioned these dispositions, right, earlier, these interpersonal competencies. I mean, if you think about your life and the kinds of things that are most helpful to you post-college, it's these kinds of attributes, right? Being able to manage your time, being flexible, being resilient in the face of challenges that you've never faced before, understanding what people are saying to you and then responding. And then this bottom line of fancy education needs, neurocognitive competencies. What the crystallized and fluid intelligence represent is crystallizes that stuff you kind of memorized. You know, it's the knowledge base. But with fluid intelligence, which everybody can manage and develop, this is where you learn how to use what you know in circumstances that are brand new, to kind of stretch yourself, to kind of reorganize what you know and are able to do to meet evolving circumstances. They asked Google managers a few years ago, well, you know, if someone has the basic requirements, who do you want to hire, right? And here's the list of I would say, dispositional attributes that Google managers want. These are 85,000 people work for Google around the world now. You take a look at this list, and again, I ask you, you know, where in the college curriculum, you know, nobody majors in this stuff, but where in the kind of college experience do students get an opportunity to practice, to learn and practice these kinds of attributes? And I've made a point here of saying, look, employers love this stuff, and they do. So you get 9 out of 10 saying, hey, I want to hire somebody who's had an experience, an internship, or an apprenticeship, as we say, doing the kinds of things that we do in this organization. And you can see these other kinds of high impact practices here, the experiential learning that employers are increasingly valuing as they look in terms of not just who they're hiring, but who will be then successful moving on in the firm. So to try to kind of get close to wrapping up here, we know how to do this work, and to be what we need to be is far more intentional about, right? This is true in every aspect of life, right? It's not just the design, but it's how well we implement these kinds of activities, right? This is John Dewey, famous educational philosopher, long time ago. Everything, not just in college, of course, but everything in life depends on the quality. And so we know the various features of that are bundled into these kinds of high impact activities, setting expectations high, kind of being redundant again with you, time and effort, and it's over an extended period. The kinds of outcomes we're after, the dispositional outcomes and other kinds of learning proficiency, these don't happen in a 75-minute class hour. They are accrued over a semester, 16 weeks, and many of these over multiple years of college, right? And the interactions between our teachers and other students who are studying many of the same things we are, very, very important. But these interactions have got to be substantive. They're just not kind of touch and go. And the more time we spend with people who are different than we are, there are some early on indicators that many students struggle with this initially. But the more experiences they have, the more effective they become in dealing with people from different backgrounds. I've already mentioned the importance of feedback. And then, of course, we want people to be able to practice what they're learning so that they themselves can see the relevance of their learning. And we need to hold students accountable for presenting themselves and demonstrating the competence that they have developed before they leave the academy. So this is a picture of a student who aced all the written material, learning how to fly, but then when it came to land the plane, well, practice, we need practice. So The bottom line here, all of these things matter, but they don't matter without some systematic reflecting on what's happening to me. And this cannot wait until the last few weeks of the college experience. This has to be an ongoing activity as students build up a greater capacity, as I said earlier, for thinking about their own thinking and how these various aspects of their college experience are fitting together. So here's the problem that we face. And what we know is that while all students benefit, and some of the students who are least well prepared for college benefit even more, the bottom line is that fewer of those students who could benefit more are participating in these activities. First, fewer students who are first in their family, fewer students, and you can read this, fewer part-time students and so forth. So this is a problem for us. How do we create what we would call an equity-oriented pattern of participation? That is, we get equal numbers of students. How do we get everybody actually into these kinds of activities, high-quality activities? So the second bullet is the genius bullet. You require them to do it. I mean, I'm at the age now where I can say these things. Look, if we know what works, why aren't we requiring it? And many institutions are now starting to do this. They're blending in a HIP in the first year, and then program graduation requirements. So how can I say this? Many students and many faculty, they don't do optional, but if you can explain to them what the benefits are and how it adds value to the undergraduate experience in the major as well as beyond, they end up doing it. Look, there are a lot of other things that can be very valuable, kind of high impact like. We know this. I wish if we had another hour to talk about these kinds of activities as well. So campus employment and in the library, they're great examples, for example, of students who work in the library who are having conversations with their supervisors, supervisors getting them to think about how what they're learning in class is being used in library work, but it's any kind of work on the campus. Could be food service, could be, manning the front desk, student information center right at the campus union and so forth. Lots of things down this list. Intercollegiate athletics, under the right coach and coaching philosophy, can be a very, very powerful experience. And it's not all about hips. There are a lot of other things that are educationally effective. I'm not going to go through this list with you. Perhaps we can talk some about this, but we have studies demonstrating that when institutions, for example, take seriously looking at courses that have high failure rates and figuring out how to reduce those rates with more effective instruction, it really works. And we know this last bullet, the best evidence that a student has mastered what it is we want them to know and be able to do is in the context of designing assignments that require students to demonstrate those proficiencies. Lots of good work going on in this area. And of course, inside the classroom, many, many different ways of approaching these kinds of outcomes. A very innovative work being done that is to reduce the amount of lecture time and involve students more actively in this learning process. And this has been done through online learning as well. Recently, more and more work has been coming out now we're kind of post-COVID, right? Demonstrating that some online classes, when they are organized correctly, can be equally effective to bricks and mortar. All right, I'm going to pause on this slide because a lot of, I was the first in my family to go to college. My father was a truck driver. He left school really in the 7th grade to work with his father on a fledgling construction company that failed back in the early 40s. My mother was second in her high school graduating class, but in those days, very few women went on. My point here is that when we sat around the dinner table, we weren't taught they had no idea what college was about really, except that they were insistent in their own way about me going, whatever it was I was going. But there was no conversation around my dinner table, right, about study abroad or doing research with a faculty member, or doing an off-campus service learning kind of experience, or an internship. Now it turned out I went to a college where a lot of people did these things. We need to get, if it's not high impact practices, some other language into the conversations that high school counselors are having, teachers are having about what matters in college. And so we need to go on a selling spree. We need to market HIPS. The little booklet to the right is something that we developed years ago, and it continues to be updated. They're free, and the parents and students will take these to a campus and they'll ask the kinds of questions of the tour guide and people in the admissions office and other places about what students actually do here. Don't tell me about how many books are in the library. No offense, librarians. How many books does a student read, right? The question is, what kind of reading do they do, and what do they do with the reading? So there are ways that we can market and sell HIPS more effectively down the list before students get to college, and certainly as they arrive, and so forth and so on, and orientation practices and registration. And of course, advisors have a huge role to play in this, in terms of making certain students are signing up for or are creating space in their academic calendar to do a HIP. So I get to the end of these things and I fall back on Aristotle, because none of us could really remember what Aristotle probably said. But this is one thing he did. If we don't know how to do these things, there's only one way to figure out how to do them. And that's true of every aspect of our life, right? We learn by doing it. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, George. My first question is how universally available are these opportunities now? Are they widespread across the college and university system, or do they happen to be grouped in particular regions? How accessible are they to students across the country?
Steve, colleges and universities have offered most of these for decades. But as I hinted at, didn't make it as big a deal as I should have. Who gets to do that, right? So what we know is students, and you mentioned, are there sectors? Well, smaller institutions tend to have proportionately more of these available. Larger institutions, they're so, I've often said Indiana University, where I worked for many years, it can be an intellectual Disneyland, right? For highly motivated, self-directed students. So a student comes to Indiana University, all of these things are available. So I don't think I said once, I might be wrong, I don't think I said once during this talk, opportunity. We often talk about opportunities. Well, opportunities are vapid. What matters is whether students do them. Opportunities abound, right? So how do institutions, as I mentioned, channel students into these things? So they're widely available, Steve. They are increasing in numbers. We did a survey about 3 years ago of provosts of public and private universities. More than 50% were working on how to increase the number of available HIPS. So this is a bit of a juggernaut. It's happening, it's increasing. But our challenge is how to get more students into that. And part of this is the marketing, the selling of high impact practices. And some institutions will say, well, wait a minute, these are too expensive. And what we know is when institutions invest in these things, there is a return on the investment, which provides more income to institutions because more students stay, you see? So they capture more tuition dollars. It's a win-win.
Question from the audience here. It seems like maybe most of the high impact practices really come down to empowering students to become more engaged in their own education. is that an appropriate way of looking at it? And if so, how might we apply that outside of college, whether it's in elementary and primary schools or just in training new employees in the workplace?
All right, that's a stump the chump question, isn't it?
Well, smart audience members.
Yeah, so too many people spending too much time reading in the library. Well, the same dynamics apply. I mean, elementary school, we don't need to teach students in elementary school how to engage. They more naturally do it. It's as they progress through the grades that we kind of stomp the creativity and ingenuity out of them and put them in structured places. But the same things that apply at the college level will work in the high school and in the middle school. Elementary schools, I'm less well familiar with. In the workplace, there was a time, you'll probably remember this. I don't know when you went to work USA Today, but when I left college, most of my friends who went into the work world were trained for 6-8 weeks in the job that they took. The military, of course, does this splendidly. You don't just join the military and told to go out and do what you do. There's rigorous training, high structure, great feedback. And the feedback in many of these places, it's like in athletics. It's loud, it's public. If you don't perform, you don't play, whatever it might be. You can think of the theater, performing arts, it's the same thing. So the workplace has its own set of dynamics. And these ideas, time on task, feedback, public display of competence, it's all right there in front of us.
Audience member asks or says, I agree with you about late registration, but could you explain what the problem is with that?
Yes, I'm glad someone read the slide and picked up on it. For years, institutions thought we were doing students favors by letting them come into a class 3 and 4 weeks after it started. This was particularly true in the 2-year sector, but it happens in the 4-year sector. And by the way, institutions benefit when they do that because they tend to get more money from state coffers when they can demonstrate we have many more, we have this number of students enrolled. So there would be a deadline set, end of September or something. And that's when we would do the head count, right? So allowing more students in. But what we discovered was most of those students who start late either don't finish or don't get credit for the class. Why? Well, they're 3 weeks behind, 4 weeks behind. There may be something going on with some of those students in terms of motivation to begin with. Why did they register late? I don't want to put too much onus on the student in this instance. What I'm saying to institutions is better for the student not to let them in because they're not going to benefit in the way in which you think.
Your one slide, and you talked about it for a bit, the fact that students are going into these high impact, taking advantage of these high impact opportunities, but not necessarily the right ones. Why is that?
Well, let me just clarify. I know you didn't mean to say what you said, but every student is the right student.
Yeah.
Every student benefits, right? But some of the students, all students should be in these. And what I'm saying, but not just what I'm saying, what the data show is that students who could benefit as much or even more, first in the family to go, they don't know in many instances, as I've tried to explain with my own example, they don't know about these things, right? Or some students, low-income students would say, well, I can't afford to study abroad. Now that is a fair statement, right? But let's be clear, a student doesn't have to do all of these things. They need to do only 2 or 3. And most institutions could weave these into all institution or program graduation requirements. So a writing intensive course, every student should have. I mean, come on. Well, you're a journalist, so you know this. We have a bias built in here. But institutions should require students to have 3 or 4 writing intensive courses as they move through. And this is just not about the humanities and social sciences and applied fields. This should be true in the sciences and so on. What I'm saying here is that, to be clear, a student doesn't need to do all of these. They just need to have 2 or 3. I said more, of course, is better, but 2 or 3 put students on a path of achievement and completion that we should applaud. So what institutions are trying to figure out now is how to work these into these, what we're calling guided pathways today. I hope I responded to the.
Yeah, and I have, you also fortunately rescued me in my formation of my question. I was indeed talking about, when I said the right students, I meant those students who could most benefit from these practices.
Yeah, as I said earlier, the more affluent students, the students who've heard conversations about this at their dinner table, or who have peers or relatives, who've done these things. So I don't want to say it comes natural, but they're not foreign to them. They've heard about these things.
Well, and to a point later in your presentation, this also falls to guidance counselors at the high school level.
And we need to make parents more aware of these things too, because many of us didn't. We may have done these things. Some of us. I mean, I have to say, I sat back once a few years ago, and I thought about my own undergraduate experience. We didn't have this language, probably just as well. But I mean, I went to a college that had all first-year students took the same. Out of the 4 courses, 3 were the exact same courses. So there was an intellectual learning community developed. I happened to play intercollegiate basketball. I was, for better or worse, the president of my social fraternity. I was an orientation advisor. I had to write a senior paper, right? That was my culminating experience. I didn't think of it as a culminating experience. I thought about it, as kind of a chain around my legs. But all of these things, there was a coherence in my undergraduate experience. Okay, Steve, I didn't recognize it, right? But as one famous economist, Howard Bowen, president of several universities, said, these kinds of experiences leave a residue, right? Very difficult to assess or measure in any way that we can convince others about, but they build up over time and they don't go away. They're sticky, and they end up opening up one's life later.
And I think you've made the point that it's not just a matter of offering these opportunities, it's a matter of also doing them right, the schools doing them right. And I want to ask, or in the case, I wanted to ask about a specific one about internships. We often hear about internships that are largely a waste of time. What advice would you have for not necessarily schools, but employers for how they can run effective internship programs and make this experience as profitable as it really should be?
Well, if you go back, and I didn't spend nearly as much time on I had a slide with the features, what makes a high impact experience high impact. Well, if you go through that list and apply it into the job setting expectations clearly, right? Feedback, prompt, on target, continuous, right? Substantive conversation between people who are involved in the work, interactions across different groups, then the demonstrating the relevance of what my studies are and how I'm using those in this context. You can't do this work. There are some places, by the way, that have terrific guidebooks about this. There's an operation, you may know of it, the Washington Center in Washington, D.C., which offers internships in the Senate and House of Representatives and other agencies. I mean, they have a terrific little guidebook that had kind of mapped the features of high impact practices to what supervisors in those internship settings should be doing with students. So you develop a contract of sorts so that both sides, both the intern and the supervisor, have a kind of mutual understanding. And you can't expect an internship to deliver the kinds of outcomes we are after with an internship light kind of experience. There has to be hands-on, there needs to be time and effort on the part of the internship supervisor, right? And it can get messy at times because you want someone on the campus also to have some role in what the students are experiencing, and not just wait until they come back and then you write up a 2-pager and say, this is what I did. Right? I will say, while even the internships that are not as well structured as I've just outlined have benefits, right? So we don't want to short circuit those. I read just the other day, though, a study of, there were some number of places that did virtual internships this past year. Some kind of worked, but the students, many of them, 2/3 gave them kind of a thumbs down.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't continue to try to do that work because we'll learn, a fair amount going forward. But as a wise person once said to me, there's no substitute for human contact.
Touching on that audience question here, is there anything to suggest that we should actively connect students with peer groups as early as possible? I think back to when I was searching for a school and how the tour experience was almost always better when it was given by a student to whom I could better relate.
Well, I thought the question was how to get involved in the peer group.
Yeah.
Well, this is classic. I mean, in fact, one of my areas of keen interest right now is peer advising. But the best advice you can give a beginning college student of any age really is pick the right friends. Now that's easy. It's kind of like telling people, be sure you're born to the right parents, because that's gonna make a world of difference in your life. But being around the right people has a huge influence. This is especially true, but not only for the 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are looking. So, who do students look to for advice? They may have an academic advisor, but who students rely on most is the person who took that course from this, or what do you plan to do next spring, right? That kind of thing. Peers can have an unusually powerful effect on one's behavior. Your peer group decides how much you're going to study, what classes you're going to take when, how you're going to spend your summer. I mean, I'm overstating it a bit here. So, my new gig is how do you create educationally purposeful peer interactions? And so there are some people around the country, and a lot of what we talk about with high impact practices has some of that built in, because most of these kinds of activities have small groups of other students involved.
Study groups and the like.
Study groups, internships, not so much. Service learning, always working with other peers. Yeah. So it's very important. I mean, we could talk more about that, but yeah, it's very, very important.
We all know about the challenges that higher education had even before the pandemic with funding, and that, of course, has been compounded. Are these practices, is this element of education any more or less affected by the pandemic, either from the school standpoint or from the student standpoint?
I think so. As we just mentioned, some of this stuff had to go virtual, and I will say, well, just going back to kind of peer advising, peer mentoring, and so on and so forth. Peer tutoring. There are some firms, these are for-profit firms that are working with campuses that have set up technology-enhanced peer tutoring. And those schools that have done this actually showed an increase in the number of students who were seeking tutoring. And you talk about these equity gaps, and in most instances, the increase in students getting tutoring were coming from groups that had historically not sought tutoring. First gen, right? Low income students, either not knowing where the resources were. And this was typically done word of mouth. The word gets out, students are talking among themselves and so forth and so on. So yes, I think COVID set us back, but that's a temporary interruption, only because students were away from the campus, or if they were near the campus, they were cloistered. And so fewer students got to do many of the things that we had momentum in. I think we'll get that momentum back because the work is too powerful and the data are too powerful.
Well, Dr. Koo, this has been terrific. We've hit about our hour mark. This has been fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, the presentation. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you all.
I hope to run into you sometime when I'm in the Bloomington, Indianapolis area.
Be happy to see you. We'll go to lunch.
That sounds good.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good night, all.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.